Thank you very much. I'm honored and pleased to be here because one thing that I have learned working for human rights, both within United Nations and the Council of Europe and for non-governmental organizations, is that social workers are absolutely crucial in the struggle for human rights. And I'm pleased to talk on the theme of social equality and human rights, because one of the conclusions I have drawn from working for human rights is that there is a crucial link between social equality and the possibility of realizing human rights. There is a linkage there that when you have a society which is more or less equal, human rights are better protected. And the relationship goes in the other direction as well. With efforts for human rights, you tend to have a more equal society. So the two concepts are very close to one another. This, of course, goes very much for efforts for economic and social rights, but also, in fact, for other human rights as well, the traditional freedoms and other aspects of political and civil rights. In fact, only this statement is controversial, because what it does is that it exposes the fact that human rights and work for human rights is actually very close to politics. It's politically controversial. And we who have been working for human rights for years, we have really tried to stand above politics and not to be controversial when it comes to party politics and ideological battles. But in fact, we have, of course, to recognize that human rights are not outside politics. In fact, struggle for human rights is a very important political matter. And what we really aim for is to put the work for human rights high on the political agenda. We have, of course, hoped that standards and norms for human rights should be seen as above party politics. And we have hoped that all governments of the world would accept the agreed human rights standards and norms, irrespective of their political color. To some extent, this has been successful, at least at the stage of drafting, adopting, and ratifying the human rights treaties. A major problem, however, has been the lack of serious implementation of too many governments. Of course, in some cases, this has been due to armed conflicts and other man-made, but also natural disasters, including those relating to climate change. Here, I would, however, like to focus on the ideological obstacle, and thereby, I think, being quite controversial. I think it is necessary for those who have now a long experience in human rights to state what our conclusions are when it comes to the policies of governments in order to genuinely implement and make reality of human rights. During the last 6 years, I've mainly focused on human rights situations in Europe, and I happen to know that about 46% of the audience here now have their roots in Europe. But I hope and believe that some of the conclusions I'm trying to define has relevance also for other parts of the world. But anyhow, here in Europe, social equality has been gradually undermined step by step for several years by now. Gaps in income, wealth, and the other aspects determining the individual standard of living have been widened in Europe for the last 3 decades by now. Poverty has grown. Though Europe may be regarded still as a rich continent, at least in comparison to other parts of the globe, we have about 800 million people living in Greater Europe, also the Europe outside the European Union. And of these 800 million, we are estimating that 150 million live in poverty today. That is, households with less than half of the country's median income. Many elderly people, and the minister referred to the situation of old people in her speech, people with disabilities live in extremely poor circumstances, and which have become worse during the economic crisis. Women still suffer from pay inequalities and job discrimination, and even in the richest country in Europe, children live in acute poverty in many disadvantaged families and communities. The poor and the marginalized, among them minorities also, such as the Roma, tend to lack influence and opportunities to make their voices heard. Surveys have shown that they feel ignored by political parties, and they often have little themselves. They have little confidence in the authorities. And when they are victims of crime, they hesitate to report to the police because of mistrust. In courts, they are at a disadvantage in comparison to those who can hire senior lawyers, and in prisons they are overrepresented. And children living in poverty often have little support to cope with the problems in school. Some do not speak the majority language and are therefore doubly excluded. Social exclusion is passed from one generation to the next. Inequalities in our societies prevent social mobility. Several of these problems are, in fact, consequences of political decisions, and that has to be said. Social legislation in recent years have been reformed, in inverted commas. Social services have been reduced, and support to the most vulnerable have been cut back. Care for the aged, disabled people, and children in trouble have been privatized, and the oversight of these new private enterprises has not been sufficient in a number of cases. Inmates in social institutions have thereby been victimized. This trend was there already before the 2008 economic crisis, but has become worse thereafter. And in response to the crisis, enormous sums of taxpayers' money have been made available and poured into the banking system in order to prevent a global financial meltdown. Ordinary people were forced to pay for the reckless practices of a few. Increased unemployment placed a further burden on state budgets, and there was therefore less space for social assistance, just at the very time when needs grew inevitably. And in this situation, economic balance became the overarching political aim. Governments on this continent introduced austerity programs in the midst of the recession, and unemployment grew further, not surprisingly. Many leading economists questioned the wisdom of this policy, and human rights activists warned about the social consequences, but to fairly little avail. Only very recently could we see some signs of rethinking austerity programs in a recession are now, at long last, being questioned. So we have a situation where the original financial crisis turned into a broader economic crisis, which in turn ended up in what I think we have to call a political crisis. We have clear tendencies of tensions in our societies in Europe today, signs of lacking trust in the political establishment, and even outbursts of social unrest. One side effect has been the growth of extreme nationalistic movements, some of them deeply Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Roma, and anti-migrants. These racist and xenophobic tendencies do certainly complicate the work for human rights in our societies. In his inauguration speech in January 2009, in the beginning of the deep crisis, the US President Barack Obama made the point that the crisis is not only the result of reckless risk-taking by some bank officials, or the, as he said, greed and irresponsibility on part of some. It was also, he said, the result of our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for the new age. Our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare ourselves for the new age. That new age will not arrive, according to our assessment, if we continue to ignore the deep inequalities and injustices in our societies. These inequalities undermine social cohesion and thereby threaten the security of all. They clearly violate the principles of human rights, which we have, in fact, pledged to respect. Instead of allowing these inequalities to grow even further, the current global crisis ought to be a turning point for concrete measures to restore social justice. It has to be recognized that this crisis goes deeper than to its obvious economic aspects. It touches on questions of public confidence and ethical values. It is time to start building a cohesive society which excludes no one and leaves no one behind. It has indeed been shown that an equal, rights-respecting society is better for everyone, not only for the most vulnerable in society. Equal communities have less illness and longer life expectancy than unequal communities. Facts about social problems and crime rates demonstrates that inequalities, even in the most affluent societies, create insecurity, which in turn harms everyone. This is indeed a human rights challenge. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings have the right to a standard of living adequate for their health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. That was in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration. There has been some resistance in the United States to recognizing these rights, and also the right to education, as full human rights. Also in Europe, there have been some hesitation about recognizing these rights. It has been argued that an adequate standard of living cannot be more than an ambition. Thereby, the obligations will be less binding on government. But this is not what the agreed human rights treaties actually say. An overwhelming majority of states have ratified the United Nations Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and many European states have endorsed the European Social Charter and its revised European Social Charter. In fact, many countries have now adopted a comprehensive legal approach outlawing all forms of discrimination on whatever grounds at home. Ombudsmen or other offices have also been established to promote equal opportunities and anti-discrimination. However, major aspects of social injustices are often not tackled in the context of these efforts against discrimination. The focus has instead been on status-based equality, such as gender or race. This is important in itself, but a distinction between these two forms of injustices is actually artificial. They are, in many real-life cases, totally intertwined, as is demonstrated, for instance, through the phenomenon of female poverty. Both these types of injustices must be tackled with a comprehensive approach, and this is also argued by an organization in London called Equal Rights Trust, which has presented an interesting declaration of principles on equality. The text was drafted by human rights and equality law specialists, and though it has no formal status, it has been endorsed by a great number of international human rights experts, and it has been a good guidance for myself and other human rights activists. One of the major points in this declaration is that positive or affirmative action is necessary to overcome past disadvantage and to accelerate progress towards equality for particular groups. It also makes clear that equal treatment is not the same as identical treatment. To realize full and effective equality, it is necessary to assert the equal worth of people by treating them differently according to their different circumstances and enhancing their capabilities to participate in society as equals. Perhaps this link between the individual and society as a whole was what the drafters of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights had in mind when they wrote in one article, "Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized." Thank you.